Saturday evening at 7:26 Paris time, the gavel came down after representatives of 195 nations at the COP21 conference voted yes on what could be a truly significant deal on slowing climate change. The world is still analyzing what transpired there, but here in New York earlier that same day, people didn't want to miss the opportunity to make a strong statement. And what better place to do it than the Statue of Liberty, a symbol of freedom, and its partner, civil disobedience.
Well, this past weekend, hundreds gathered on Liberty Island wearing red to represent the danger zone our warming planet has entered. It was part of a demonstration in Paris and other places around the world to demand that respective governments take even bolder actions on the climate crisis. Now, to give us a rundown of the hows and whats of the event and its impacts, we want to welcome Mimi Bluestone, an educator, journalist, and activist with 350 NYC. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I want to say to a Brooklyn audience, I'm also with 350 Brooklyn, which is a new 350 group that we started last May. So.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for being here today. We want to talk about the event from the weekend, but first we want to know, what do you think about the decisions that came down in Paris this past week?
I'm really still digesting them because obviously this is a huge agreement, 196 countries. It covers really pretty much everything about the global economy. So it's a lot to take in. I would say that it's definitely an important step. It certainly puts us ahead of where we were 2 weeks ago, but I see it as a beginning and not as the solution. It's not a panacea. It doesn't really take us far enough. If you look at what scientists say about what we need to do to maintain a safe, livable climate, we need to keep warming at no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius beyond what it was, beyond what temperatures were at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, we're already hitting 1 degree centigrade Celsius, take your pick. So we're already hitting 1 degree. And we are already seeing some pretty devastating consequences. In the last few years, we here in New York saw Superstorm Sandy. That wasn't even a hurricane, it was a storm. In the Philippines, they had Typhoon Haiyan, which was absolutely devastating to thousands and thousands of people, and which clocked, I believe, the highest winds that had ever been recorded ever in history up until that time. So this is at 1 degree. And so we're talking about allowing temperatures to rise perhaps 2 degrees, although they gave a tip of the hat to let's try to keep it below 2 degrees, but 2 degrees is what was kind of agreed on several years ago. And the really worrisome thing is that if you look at what the governments have agreed to in terms of bringing their emissions down, we're talking about 3.5 degrees Celsius. No one really knows what happens to the planet. No one really knows what happens to the climate at that point. But we don't yet have the commitments that we need to stay at a safe level.
So speaking of those commitments, it's hard to get 196 folks in a room to agree to a lunch order, let alone something moving forward. So do you think this was sort of the opening salvo that we can actually strengthen things? Because I know there's been a lot of weak points that people have pointed out about the accord, but do you think it's really refocused us so we can do some really substantive actions?
I think one of the most important things coming out of this is an agreement to revisit these commitments every few years. I think that's incredibly important. But I also think what's incredibly important is that people around the world don't just leave it to their governments to make these decisions.
And say they made the agreement, so.
Yeah, it's not enough. People around the world forced governments to get to the table in the way that they did.
Just got to keep the pressure on.
It's absolutely essential to keep the pressure on, and that's why people were in the streets of Paris this weekend, drawing a red line, dressed in red, carrying red banners, saying...
And Liberty Island.
And in Liberty Island, we were doing the same thing.
When you look at the protests on Liberty Island this weekend and the fact that it was 65 degrees, I mean, does that speak volumes to you about what's going on with climate change? And if so, what does it say to you?
It says to me that we're in really big trouble. I'm old enough to remember when it always snowed in New York before Thanksgiving. I don't think we're going to have any snow this year yet. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have snow. That doesn't mean we don't have erratic weather.
Right.
I mean, James Imhoff put that snowball on the table in the Senate to say, oh, well, there is no global warming. Look, here's a snowball. That's not what it means. Of course, we still have great variations in weather. And in fact, last winter was extreme weather, which perhaps is tied to climate change. I don't think that's been established yet, but it was the temperatures were quite extremely cold. But overall, yeah, we're on a very dangerous course in terms of warming, in terms of melting of the polar ice caps, melting Greenland. And so the Statue of Liberty is a really apt symbol of what's at risk. She's out there sitting in the harbor, and she's at risk of drowning. She's also at risk of very high winds. She's anchored into that pedestal so as to withstand 125 mile per hour winds. But we're seeing winds that are much stronger in parts of the world now.
So we got lots of pictures from the action this weekend. So what's next? What do you guys intend to do, and how can folks of goodwill help you to keep the pressure on to make sure that this accord is maintained and that we take even more substantive steps in the future?
I think what's really interesting about climate change and confronting climate change is that there are 1,000 fronts. It's not an issue that has any one silver bullet. There is a front almost everywhere you look. There are pipelines being constructed right now in Westchester. A number of people were arrested in the last few weeks in Westchester trying to block those pipelines. One of the really terrifying things about those pipeline projects is that one of these pipelines is going to convey natural gas about 100 feet from the Indian Point nuclear reactor. I mean, I don't know about you, but I find that absolutely terrifying, and I think everyone in New York City and in the metropolitan area should be up in arms over that. We're all at incredible risk from that. So there's a front right there. We won a victory in Port Ambrose, which is an offshore location south of Jones Beach, where a developer was proposing to build a major liquefied natural gas terminal, and that would have eliminated the possibility of having offshore wind at that site. Now, studies indicate that if we're really going to get New York to kick the fossil fuel habit, we have to rely very much on offshore wind, which is a great potential resource in our region.
You can see it from the beach out there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we did win this victory at Port Ambrose, but now we really have to push to build those offshore wind turbines and get that going. So there's absolutely no shortage of fronts to fight. I mean, there are also those of us who think that the Koch brothers have way too much influence in our political system and have worked with corporations like ExxonMobil, which devoted millions of dollars to lie about what its scientists already knew about climate change. So we want to confront the corporations that are spreading these lies about climate change. Divestment is another really important front. I'm a retired New York City high school teacher, and I've worked within the United Federation of Teachers, my union, to
get out of those bad fuels.
Get our pension funds out of those bad fuels. And so the UFT Delegate Assembly this fall unanimously passed a resolution asking the pension fund to start investigating the role of fossil fuels in our pension fund and what we should do about that.
Well, thank you for coming on BK Live to talk about it and encourage people to get involved. We hope you can come back again sometime, because obviously it's an ongoing conversation and one that we could have.
So break off that website just so we can get out of here.
Our website, 350brooklyn.org.
All right.
Thank you so much. Thanks.